Welcome. I'm Ogan Garel. You're watching Eye on Harvard. We have a great show ahead of us. For those of you who were with us last week or watched us on the archive, we taped live from Munich, Germany. We had Jan Hummel, a leading private equity and asset manager, as well as Dr. Frank Christ, who's executive director of the Harvard Munich Medical Alliance, speaking from Munich last week. After exhausting plane rides, we're back here in Chicago. And in fact, we have a fabulous guest who is a leading Chicagoan, a native Chicagoan, and obviously also a Harvard graduate with us today, John McCarter, who is president and CEO of the Field Museum of Natural History. And we're going to talk about some great topics, including his background at Harvard, how it's affected his career, some aspects of his career which have been very illustrious, which I'll talk about shortly, and obviously his role at one of the leading natural history museums in the world. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Logan.
It's a pleasure to have you. Let me tell the audience a little bit about your background. It's very long indeed, but as I mentioned, John McCarter is president and CEO of the Field Museum of Natural History. He graduated from the Harvard Business School in 1963. And the Field Museum, for many of you that may be aware, is one of the leading world-renowned museums in natural history, has programs in environmental conservation, evolutionary biology, geology, and many other areas that are of great importance to, in particular, for example, my daughter, who went there last Wednesday on a school field trip. We'll talk a little bit about that, and millions of interested visitors worldwide. Mr. McCarter is a native Chicagoan. He was previously senior vice president at Booz Allen Hamilton, where he had leading clients at ConAgra, Chicago Board of Trade, and Procter & Gamble. He has a long list of trusteeships and directorships and board memberships. The ones that really struck me was he's the trustee of the Executive Committee of the University of Chicago, and he was also previously a trustee of Public Television Channel 11.
Right.
And insofar as we are at a leading edge at in-time TV with internet television, I think his leading role in network television would be very interesting to gain some perspectives and share ideas. Welcome again,
Thank
John.
you. Good to be here.
So tell us a little bit. First of all, did I miss anything in your bio?
No, you did just fine. It's a long one because I'm aged. I've been at this a long time.
Well, thanks for being with us. Tell us a little bit, when we have guests, we usually segue in terms of their Harvard experience. Anything in particular about your Harvard experience that affects you now or guided your career path as you see it?
Well, of course, I was at the business school, and
Right.
at the time, the Charles was the widest river in the world. We were sort of segregated off there with very little to do with the main campus. But I went there from the London School of Economics, and I had gone directly out of college to London. So I went in without any business experience. So it was a challenge that first year to sort of sort out what all this stuff was about. Then I had a great summer at the Inland Steel Company working with a great teacher who did not go to Harvard by the name of Carl Zeisler. And Carl taught me the ins and outs of money management. We were building a war chest to construct a new steel mill down on the harbor, and so we were building what at the time was an enormous amount of money. It was over $100 million. So I had the fun of understanding the bills and the notes and the bonds, and so I went back to the second year, concentrated in finance, and then came to a conclusion that I was really interested just in coming back to Chicago. So a lot of people were oriented to be in the financial world or go to Boeing to be aeronautical engineers or whatever, but my focus was always coming back to Chicago.
In terms of financial world, that would be New York at that time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Now North Carolina.
Well, and increasingly it's globalized. London has, I believe, surpassed New York in terms of public issues last year.
Is that right?
Right. But Chicago has been a finance center. Tell us a little bit about how you've been a leading Chicagoan and obviously a citizen of the world through some of your other involvements. But give us some insight how Chicago has changed over these years.
Well, you know, Carl Sandburg would say, hog butcher to the world, maker of steel, you know, etc. And the city transforms itself. Just in the time that I've been around, the stockyards have closed.
Mm-hmm.
The meatpacking industry decentralized out into the country to put the packing plants closer to where the cattle achieved enormous efficiencies in doing that, moved to largely non-union labor, single floor, efficient layouts rather than the old Swift and Armor plants, which were 5 stories up and down at the stockyards. The steel mills in large part have transformed themselves, a lot less of that going on today. But the things that strike me about Chicago today are, one, it's the transportation hub of the country. So that clearly,
indeed, even the world to some
geographically is critical to us. But the other is the whole financial markets and what has happened with the Board of Trade now merging with the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, Chicago Board Options Exchange, the Chicago stock market. While we have moved into a period where we're basically branch offices in terms of commercial banking, with all the banks now owned from outsiders, either New York or North Carolina or traditional, most recently the Netherlands and Toronto. So that has not been a positive development for Chicago. But on the other hand, the whole risk management through the exchanges has been an enormous boon.
Right.
And so much of, I think, what we see in the way of younger people who become interested in the Field Museum, so many of them are making their careers in private equity, in hedge equity investments, and in options and contract trading at the Merc and the Board of Trade.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that about Chicago transforming itself. I think it's hard to put a label on Chicago, like you had mentioned at the outset. City of the stockyards, etc. That's a bygone era, and I think I had heard it elsewhere about Chicago has an ability to literally change itself over the years. I imagine that makes fundraising, which is probably an important part of your role, difficult, because the group that you want to fundraise from, and to some extent the major donors, if you will, obviously you want to reach out to the population more generally, is always changing.
That's right. And what you do is, Willie Sutton said on, banks, you go where the money is. And there's been an exodus of corporate headquarters from Chicago. So no longer do we have Amoco or Ameritech or Quaker Oats. The list just goes on and on. So what you do is, as those corporations have moved, and traditionally a number of them were enormous philanthropic supporters of the community. What you do is
the Field Museum, of course.
Absolutely. And what you do is you look for other ways of philanthropy helping the institutions.
Right.
And we all, the Lyric, the Symphony, the universities, we're all focused on reorienting to find where these new sources of philanthropy are.
Well, that's an interesting challenge. We're just coming up to a break. I think there's an interesting connection to your inland steel experience managing the $100 million fund and learning, and then managing the Field Museum fundraising and all that. We'll talk about that right after the break.
Okay, good.
Stay right there. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Michael Momando. You're watching the In Time TV network, where professionals save big time connecting with their community worldwide. If you're in the restaurant or hospitality industry, I invite you to tune in to Restaurant Talk, where you can email or call in questions, comments, or concerns. You may even be a guest on our weekly Saturday show. To see a recent tasty episode of Restaurant Talk, please tune in to www.intimetv.com.
When someone abducts a child, they're not about to advertise it. But we will. Sign up at wirelessamber-alerts.org to get free Amber Alert text messages on your cell phone. Help put a child abductor out of business for good. Wireless Amber Alerts. A child is calling for help.
Welcome back. You're watching Eye on Harvard, brought to you by In Time TV. Our guest, distinguished guest, is John McCarter, the president and CEO of the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, but certainly a global institution in its own right. Just before the break, we were talking about some of the interesting challenges as Chicago transforms itself, that the typical, or I should say the traditional corporate sponsors are less prominent, and there are additional challenges in fundraising. So that was what we just had before the break. Tell us a little bit more, John.
Well, one aspect of this is that philanthropy kind of merges into marketing.
Interesting, yes.
And sponsorships with many corporations, it's a blend, because you're competing with, they could take advertising dollars and put them on television or radio or whatever, or they could sponsor exhibits at the museums. And and then you find wonderful new sponsors. Currently, we have an exhibition up of the 100 greatest maps. Actually, there are 133
I heard about that,
of these,
yes.
and these have come from all over the world. What more logical sponsor of this than Navtech? Because they're doing the software and the data collection for everything that's in all these handheld and automotive navigation devices. So this was the first significant sponsorship that Navtech has had. Well, there clearly was philanthropy in that, but there was also brand identification and establishment of Navtech as a leader in the field of digital mapping. So we've had support from the Harris Bank, from Bank of America, clearly from Exelon, who has been a terrific sponsor at the Field Museum, and just a number of corporations. But every time that you're talking with corporations, it's the philanthropic arm, but it's also the marketing arm. So you've got to make sure that you provide the kind of exposure that they would all like to have.
Well, I don't want to say a controversial question, but I will anyway, I guess. One of the big things about corporate sponsorship is naming. I think the city of Chicago is going into this, and we had Marshall Field's. That wasn't a philanthropic issue, of course, being renamed as Macy's.
Yep.
Is the Field Museum name up for grabs?
Well, it's got. I mean, we are the surviving field.
Yeah, that's. And Marshall Field was a Harvard graduate, or one of his sons, I think.
Yeah, Marshall, who just is now vice chairman of the board, who had been chairman of the board up until 2 years ago.
Yes.
It's interesting, when Marshall Field was first approached to support the World Columbian Exposition at the time of the World's Fair in 1893. The individual who was talking with him said, "Marshall Field, you can sell dry goods until hell freezes over. Nobody will remember your name 20 years later, but fund this Field Museum and you will be known in perpetuity." Well, the Marshall Field department store name survived perhaps longer than the solicitor had thought, but ultimately it's now Macy's, so that's gone. So the name now continues at the Field Museum, and no, there are no plans to put any other name
Well,
on the
so
Field
here
Museum.
you have it for the record, and for all of you that were very upset about Macy's taking over Marshall Field's, we have a remaining bastion of the Field Museum.
Absolutely. Now, within the Field Museum, there are many naming opportunities, so we can always talk about that whenever you'd like to.
Yes, certainly. So that's an interesting trend. Back in the Gilded Age, of which, and I don't want to presume the history of American history, but individuals, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and certainly Marshall Field were great philanthropists. Then we had this whole corporate age, and as you indicated, certainly in Chicago locally, there's a lot of positive economic developments, but some headquarters leaving. And with companies changing so rapidly, Enron was in the Fortune 100, and now it doesn't exist. And many other similarities. Google didn't exist, and now it does exist. Do you think that personal philanthropy is becoming more significant?
Sure, absolutely. And when you go back to the historical reference that you made, you go back to the turn of the last century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, and what did you have? Well, you had Marshall Field doing the Field Museum. John G. Shedd, the Shedd Aquarium, Shedd was the second president of Marshall Field's. The Simpson Auditorium, the James Simpson Auditorium at the Field Museum, Simpson was the third president of Marshall Field's. The Adler Planetarium. Max Adler was a vice president of Sears. The Museum of Science and Industry was funded by Julius Rosenwald, the chairman of Sears, who then asked his name to be removed, and we now have Museum of Science and Industry rather than the Rosenwald Museum, which is where it started. And then you had Montgomery Ward and the lakefront ordinance coming out of Ward's legal initiatives of keeping the lakefront ever open and free.
Interesting.
So those great merchants, retailers, wholesalers, mail order people at the turn of that last century were enormously important philanthropically, but also in community leadership. So what we need to do now is to find new kinds of leaders that exist in our community today.
Do you think that exists? I mean,
Sure, it does, absolutely.
But we don't hear a lot of the same names.
You don't hear a lot of the same names, and you don't hear the corporate names. But the opportunity to have affiliations, trusteeships, I think this is a wonderful philanthropic community. When I talk with colleagues in other cities around the country, this is not New York. I mean, the depth of wealth in New York is just extraordinary.
Yes.
But it's not New York. But philanthropically, this is a very strong community. Wonderful families.
Right, and very committed and very Chicago-oriented.
Right.
And let's go into a little bit about the Field Museum.
Okay, good.
As I mentioned, my daughter had the opportunity. She was very excited, and I told her that we were interviewing you, and she was too embarrassed to come on. She said,
We'll get her to come down again.
We'll
give her a tour.
Give her a tour of the studio here and all that. But she did say that she did this as part of a science project.
Yeah.
The Charles Darwin exhibit,
Yeah.
and we're approaching a break, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of the Field Museum in public education, and certainly evolution being a very challenging part of that. We'll talk about that right after the break.
Great. Okay.
You're watching Eye on Harvard, brought to you by In Time TV. Our guest, John McCarter, MBA 63, President and CEO of the Field Museum. Stay right there. We'll be right back.
No matter where you live, life in the oceans depends on you. To keep our oceans clean, recycle and dispose of trash properly. To learn what you can do, go to keepoceansclean.org.
Once they've outgrown their toddler seat, they're still not ready for adult safety belts alone. 4'9" is the magic number. Until then, kids need a booster seat. Make sure your little pumpkin gets there safely. Visit boosterseat.gov.
Welcome back. You're watching Eye on Harvard, brought to you by In Time TV. Just to, how should I say, a little legal note. As you know, we are not officially affiliated with Harvard University. Our guests and our topics are about Harvardians affecting the world and the world affecting Harvardians. And certainly that is the theme, but this is not an official network or official venue or official media outlet for the university. Our guest is John McCarter. He's president and CEO of the Field Museum of Natural History here in Chicago. Just before the break, we were talking about the public education function of the Field Museum, and we jumped right into the topic of evolution because the Charles Darwin exhibit is prominent, is one of the exhibits, which we'll talk about some of the others. And my daughter had the opportunity, which she really enjoyed, to see that. She's in 7th grade, obviously influential. And are there controversies around this? Do you get letters? Do you get maybe worse than that? we don't want you teaching our children this, or tell us a little bit about this whole area, evolution, creationism.
Okay, well, first, just in the broader education, we have over 200,000 kids every year coming to the museum, just like your daughter did in trips. We have focused much more now on inner city education, because particularly with kids who do not have the advantages of a home, a full home, or a really great education. And we're also now focusing earlier and earlier. We opened in September the Crown Family Play Lab, back to the subject of philanthropy.
Exactly.
And we're focused on 2 to 8-year-olds. And this is a small museum. It's a mini museum inside the Great Big Field Museum. So
you don't want the 2-year-olds climbing on the, what was the name of the dinosaur?
Sue. The
Sue,
dinosaur.
that's right.
No,
Sue,
we don't want them climbing. But we have great opportunities down there for climbing and drumming and all sorts of things. We have a research powerhouse with over 200 scientists. We're in 94 countries around the world. But in addition, an important focus is public education.
Yes, of course.
Now, to evolution. 2.5 years ago, we opened an exhibit called Evolving Planet.
Mm-hmm.
And what we did was to go back over the 4.6 billion years of life on Earth, from the earliest origins of life and the alternative theories about how that might have happened, chemicals in deep sea vents, asteroids coming in,
electrical discharges,
all of that, right on through the dinosaurs and then the human evolution. We have a wonderful model of Lucy, and then on into challenges that we as the dominant species of the world are creating, are causing. We had over 1 million people come through in the first year of that. And back on philanthropy, this was underwritten and sponsored by 2 marvelous funders. First of all, Ken and Ann Griffin, Diaz Griffin, and Citadel. And then second, the Elizabeth Morse Genius Trust. So philanthropy, and then philanthropy.
Those are individuals, as we mentioned about.
Those are individuals, and then a trust that came out of an individual.
Right.
And then a number of Illinois Toolworks, Abbott Laboratories, the Farrow family, the Miles White family. A number of philanthropists came together to make this story of evolution available. So over 1 million people. Then I have always admired both Charles Darwin, which obviously famed, but then secondly Gregor Mendel, who was working at the same time as Darwin was. He knew of Darwin, Darwin did not know of him. And the problem that Darwin had was really explaining inheritance. And here is this monk, this friar, who was worked out with his experiments with peas, the entire nature of dominant and recessive inheritance.
They were completely in parallel without communicating. And in fact, Darwin just postulated some genetic elements.
That's right.
And Mendel
had figured it out.
But he didn't look at the wider picture of the evolution.
A very tight focus.
Species, cross-species, if you will, yes.
So, so we brought, having opened this permanent exhibition on evolution, we came back with Gregor Mendel and told that story, and now that exhibit that we built is touring around to 6 or 7 other museums around the country. And then we came in with Charles Darwin. So we're telling the general story and then reinforcing it with these 2 subsequent stories. Now, as to the controversy, there is now a new museum that you may have read about, and this is the Museum of Creation.
I think I remember reading that,
across the river from Cincinnati. And this is a very different story of evolution. This is a young earth theory, that all of this happened, as it says in the Bible, literal translation, over the course of the last 6,000 years. And that the dinosaurs were on the ark with Noah. $27 million investment.
Really?
From everything that I have heard, and I'm going to go down there in January, the place has been packed. The yellow school buses that you see outside the Field Museum or Shedd Aquarium or Science and Industry are lined up outside of this, telling a very different story.
That's amazing.
And it is amazing. And this is, my understanding is this is the first of 10 museums that are going to be built around this theme. So you think about $250 million invested into a story that is clearly does not accept the evolution that is accepted by, basically. So we had a couple of years ago...
The vast majority of scientists.
The vast majority of scientists. A couple of years ago we had the Dover, Pennsylvania decision where they were attempting to insert intelligent design as a competitive theory in the teaching of evolution in the schools. Well, the thing that's great about the trustees, the board of trustees of the Field Museum and of the Field Museum, the scientists there, is we are going to tell the story as we see it. And we don't want to be intimidated, and we won't be intimidated by people who, as they do in so many school settings, are just saying, you know, you can't teach that. Or as we have in the Kansas situation. Well, we thought maybe this would be all, you know, put to bed by the Dover, Pennsylvania decision, but intelligent design just keeps working their way of alternatives. And, you know, the thing that concerns me so deeply is this is a fundamental issue of public awareness and public education. At the same time that we're concerned about flat world competitiveness of PhDs coming out of China and India, the distortion, really, of putting all of this investment against a story that is...
Well, we'll talk about that right after the break. It's an incredibly important topic. I'm so glad that you're here, and we'll get the message out. Stay right there.
Today, we're moving faster than ever before. Even your ideal prospect will see your ad, click to your website, then decide to read on or read none in a mere 1 to 7 seconds. After that, you become invisible. So what's the answer? How do you capture and hold the attention of your target audience? In Time TV. The In Time TV network broadcasts industry-specific TV shows to the people who buy your products: surgeons, primary care physicians, dentists, podiatrists, chiropractors, hospital administrators can now watch live in-time programs on widescreen, on their PC or laptop while checking email. Shows can even be viewed on a cell phone during a train commute. In-Time TV is peer-to-peer TV that covers the hot topics in industries that you sell to. In-Time TV shows are broadcast worldwide via the internet, yet the cost of running a 60-second commercial is a fraction of what you'd pay for a display ad in a trade magazine. In-Time TV is what your target audience is watching.
Keeping professionals engaged worldwide.
Mom?
Dad?
How long should I wait for you?
If I'm at soccer practice.
What if something happens? Will you come get me?
There's no reason not to have a plan in case of an emergency.
Should we go to the neighbor's house?
And some extremely good reasons why you should.
Can you tell me?
Talk to your family about what you would do in case of an emergency.
Welcome back. I'm Ogan Gurel. You're watching Eye on Harvard, brought to you by In Time TV. We're discussing a very important topic, I would say, one of the central fronts of the culture wars, I would imagine, regarding evolution, creationism, and how the Field Museum has had a sequence of exhibits. And I thought that that was very interesting, how you've not had one-off exhibits, if you will, an art exhibit or something, but there's almost a theme and a sequence to multiple exhibits. Right now it's the Charles Darwin exhibit, there was the Gregor Mendel exhibit prior, and then the Evolution of the Earth exhibit. And then you had mentioned a very surprising fact, although I had heard about something of that, where across from Cincinnati was the Museum of Creation,
right,
with a $27 million investment.
Right.
Which is just one of 10 planned.
That's my understanding.
Fortunately, mathematics has not been out of the public school curriculum, so I know enough mathematics that 10 times 27 is 270 million. So we're talking about $250 million
Absolutely.
investment in, quote, educating the public.
Right.
In creationism.
Right.
I want to lend a little bit of my own perspective on this. And you had intimated that when we have fundamental, how should I put it, a loss of education of certain scientific elements, that can bode very poorly for the economic, military, and indeed cultural strength of the nation. What comes to mind is when we instituted Star Wars, I think the Soviets realized that the game was over.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons was, and I talked to some Soviet people or former Soviet people about this, is that even though Soviet engineering and mathematics was superlative, their computer science was way behind, and in particular their software.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost infantile back in the 80s compared to what the United States had. And of course Star Wars was hardware, but also really required very sophisticated software. And one of the reasons was that the Soviet theology, if you will, or they didn't have theology, but philosophy was very much against cybernetics.
Mm-hmm.
And the cybernetics, anti-cybernetics, put a real damper on computer science development in the Soviet Union, such that they couldn't compete by the end of the 80s when we were unveiling, Ronald Reagan was unveiling Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
And you never know where suppression of a particular scientific endeavor
Right.
will bite you later on. And I'm just wondering if that's the kind of thing you're thinking of.
Well, and again, my orientation is not to matters of faith. I mean, that's not our business.
In terms of scientific,
it's the scientific
exactly,
side of it. The other example from Russia is when you visit the Natural History Museum in Moscow, which is a very small and primitive institution, and there is a wall of the great geneticists of the early 20th century in Russia, born 1893, born 1899, born 1902, died 1938, died 1938, died 1938.
Exactly, right.
And Lysenko, with this concept of inherited elements that could be acquired and then passed on. So lift weights and you can pass that strength on to your kids. Had the ear of Stalin. And ultimately this resulted in the purge of the great geneticists of Russia, of the Soviet Union. Now, what we have is something I think that's very different. We're moving into a period when we are not the dominant economic power of the world, and we are going to have competitors, and eventually those competitors are going to be playing on an even playing field. So, to me, it all starts with public education and an informed citizenry that can engage in discussions like the one that we are having right now.
About science. I mean,
about science.
Again, I think we should emphasize, we're not talking about
right.
faith.
Right.
We're talking about active suppression of scientific ideas.
Right.
And to the extent, for example, you had mentioned Lysenko, I had mentioned computer science, because that had military applications.
Right.
But with respect to Lysenko and the destruction, if you will, of the Russian genetic heritage, they had no biotech industry.
That's right.
And that was another consequence of that.
Exactly. So in a free society, and again, I think it's, it's fine for people to want to tell, the stories. And in terms of, in a way, we have found it's been less contentious at the Field Museum than we might have anticipated. In a way, we're preaching to the choir, you could say.
Right.
In that a lot of the people who come, who have, an interest in evolution, are coming to the museum to see this. But at the core of the Field Museum is the study of evolution. That's what we do. We have this next week, we have two groups coming in from around the world. One to focus on bryozoa and the evolution of bryozoa. Another to focus on the evolution of mollusks. We have a wonderful Encyclopedia of Life initiative. We have from the National Science Foundation tree of life projects and really trying to dig in at the molecular level and understand the way that animals, plants have evolved over periods of time.
And in addition to public education, you're really pushing the research side of things. We had on Eye on Harvard the distinct privilege of having one of your top faculty members, Professor Neil Shubin, on the show. It was a great show. I encourage you to look at our archives and click on that show, Neil Shubin, from worms to, I forget exactly what, but basically from fishes to worms, how their body determines who we are.
That's right. Neil's got a great book coming out in January. Your Inner Fish.
Your Inner Fish, from worms to, exactly, the title of his show was...
The first printing is 50,000 copies.
That's great. Well, I definitely want to get my hands on that one.
Good.
Both he and I talked about the influence of Stephen Jay Gould.
Yep.
And I had a great experience at Harvard. I was in biochemistry, and I did crew, which took a lot of my time. I kicked myself because I never took one of Professor Gould's courses.
Yeah.
But
well, I never knew him, but one of the things that has been a very influential for me is something that he said. You can count the number of people who come into a museum, but we don't give tests. It's informal education. And what you want is that 13-year-old girl in the bird hall looking at birds, having her imagination and curiosity stimulated, and 40 years later receiving the Nobel Prize. And so that's what you hope that you can do just at the fundamental level of public education.
And you can never guarantee that.
You can never guarantee it, and you just don't know. And but it's so rewarding to
exactly when it comes
to hear that. So Gould was, and Neil has gotten a few hits on this wonderful tiktaalik, this animal that he found up in Ellesmere Island, and because in this fish is an articulated neck, our eyes that are not on the side of the head but at the front of the head, and within the fins are digits.
Yes.
And so you really see something was going on here.
A primitive animal that's very much like us.
Yeah, right.
We'll be right back. You're watching Eye on Harvard. Stay right there. Great show up ahead.
My pot of gold, your daddy's little girl, till heaven home.
It's easy to tell if you've had way too many. But what if you've had just one too many? Buzz driving is drunk driving.
Hey guys, thanks for coming.
Are we in trouble?
No, you're not in trouble. I just want to set some ground rules.
Like what?
Well, remember last week when you hit Vinny in the head with the shovel?
I do not recall that.
Of course not. Well, it was pretty graphic. Too graphic for the kids. So I'm going to have to block you.
I got to make this up to you. This is Vinny's watch, and I want you to have it. You deserve it.
Thank you. That's really not necessary.
No. Come here.
Welcome back. You're watching Eye on Harvard. Our guest, John McCarter, President and CEO of the Field Museum of Natural History, discussing a wide range of topics about his experiences at Harvard, his career, and then obviously we're talking a lot about the Field Museum, the exhibits they've held over the years, and the central role it has in public education. I wanted to ask you, John, about, to some extent you had indicated that perhaps we're preaching to the choir. We never really know. Obviously, 1 million people come to your museum a year, 200,000 from school trips. But perhaps there are wide groups of the population who should be taking advantage of this, who would benefit from this. How are you reaching out to them?
Well, we have got a wonderful website that we're constantly redesigning. And we've gone to a program we called Expeditions from the Field. in which our scientists who are in China and Peru and Madagascar and Kenya, all around the world, doing archaeology, conservation biology, are able to communicate with people through our website as to the projects that they're embarked on. So it gives us, when we think about physical visits, I think our hits on individual pieces of our website are like 4 or 5 times the number of individuals who actually come into the museum. So I think there's a great opportunity there.
Right,
to
and that's
reach
global,
broader
of course.
Absolutely.
You had mentioned about the inner city programs.
Yeah.
And it was also interesting how you said it gives great satisfaction that some 13-year-old comes, gets a Nobel Prize 40 years down the line, or does other significant things.
Right.
Nobel Prize is not the be-all and end-all.
Right.
It's great. But I would imagine that the impact you have with inner city kids is certainly greater, if you will, leverage for each visit.
Yeah.
That's an important thing. How about groups of the population that would be going to this Cleveland, or I should say Cincinnati museum? Any other ways to reach out to them?
Well,
challenge.
One of the things that we're working on now in a consortium with Harvard, with the Smithsonian, with Woods Hole, the Marine Biological Laboratory, with the Missouri Botanical Garden, the Field Museum, and the Australian Census of Living Australia. 6 partners in this partnership. Ed Wilson, Harvard professor, E.O. Wilson,
yes,
made a wish at the TED conference, Technology, Entertainment, and Design, out in Monterey last year, which had been kind of held in abeyance, that could there be a web page for every species.
Interesting.
So Jonathan Fanton, back on philanthropy,
oh yes,
the president of the MacArthur Foundation, and Ralph Gomery, the president of the Sloan Foundation,
former advisor in science and technology,
right, said what we would like to do is to provide the initial funding to build an encyclopedia of life that would be available all around the world.
That's fantastic.
So what you would do is you'd go and you type in leopard. Up would come the home page. There would be a little bar across the page from novice to expert. So if you're a postdoctoral researcher, you got it over here on expert. If you're the 5th grader, you've
a lot of big words.
A lot of big words.
Yeah.
But what this does is it provides, through this, we are scanning all of the volumes in the Natural History Museum libraries. We are also, with the leadership of the bioinformatics team at Woods Hole, building software to scan the internet. So every time the word leopard appears, we will have film and video, we'll have genetic information, we'll have the evolutionary pattern, we'll have the range, we'll have the region of origin.
Protein structure specific to that leopard.
Exactly. Yeah. And everything that you want to know about the leopard.
That's fantastic.
And
who is directly leading that? You mentioned this is a consortium.
Yeah.
Is there a particular group that's leading
No,
that?
it's just the consortium that's doing it. Each of us has a piece of this.
So it's almost like Wikipedia,
but
it's at the institutional level, where the institutions are putting...
Yeah, it's a Wikipedia, but it's all material that's originated from the curatorial staff.
Exactly, right.
So, for example, this meeting that's taking place at the Field Museum on Bryozoa will have the dozen experts in on that. Basically lock them up in a room for 4 days and have them come out with the species structure of how they believe that Bryozoa ought to be organized. Harvard is doing the collegiate and graduate school education. The Smithsonian is doing K through 12.
Right.
Woods Hole, as I mentioned, is doing bioinformatics. The Garden is doing botany. And the Field Museum is doing what we call a biosynthesis center, where we draw together all of the leading experts in the taxonomy and the conservation of these individual species to come together to work out the naming and the organization of how. Now, so our target is, of the named species, there are 1,800,000. Next February, at the end of February, we hope to have about a dozen of these up in great detail, and then we hope to have about 30,000 others in sketch form as kind of our beta test. So over the course of the next 5 years, we want to do 1 million of these, and over the course of the next 10 years, do the complete 1,800,000, by which time there will be many more named.
That's fantastic. That's a fabulous project, Encyclopedia of Life project. An idea comes to mind, and I don't know, it might be already implemented, but yesterday's Wall Street Journal had a front page article about grim future for big pharma. And the reason for that is the lack of drugs in the pipeline.
Yep.
And it'd be interesting to almost have a map of all these species.
Yep.
And you see which species have given rise to medicines that we have now. Some of the medicines obviously have been completely synthesized, but many of them, Taxol, aspirin, etc., are derived from various plants. And perhaps you see that whole map and you see gaps that may represent useful areas, almost like drilling for oil.
Yep.
Useful species to look at.
Consistent with that, one of the additional funders now who has come in is interested in longevity. At the fundamental level, why do some species live longer?
Redwood trees, turtles.
Yeah, and so what they're interested in doing is funding lifespan research. So yes,
big pharma might be.
Absolutely, yeah.
You're watching Eye on Harvard. We have one more segment coming right up. Our guest, John McCarter, President and CEO of the Field Museum. Stay right there.
Any questions?
No.
You know.
We're not magicians, we can't read your mind.
We answer questions, each and every kind.
What are the side effects, doctor, doctor?
How many times have you done this before?
Questions are the answer.
Will this react with my other medicine?
Hey, what are all these tests even for?
You have the power to say what's on your mind.
We read your questions, each and every kind. Questions are the answer. Questions are the answer.
Welcome back. You're watching Eye on Harvard. Our guest, John McCarter, President and CEO of the Field Museum of Natural History. We've had a great program, talked about so many things, philanthropy, obviously your career, connection to Harvard, some of the great programs at the Field Museum, the sequence of exhibits to educate the public about evolution, about the evolution of the Earth, not just human beings, and more recently this fabulous project of which you're a part of, a consortium, the Encyclopedia of Life. We could go on for hours, as I know you could. Our time is limited. I wanted to talk a little bit about one of your many boardships, directorships, I should say, trusteeships. You were chairman, indeed, and as well as a board director of Public Television Chicago, Channel 11.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that. It still exists, of course, but now we're in internet TV. That was in the network TV age. Tell us a little bit about that. You were obviously in a leading role.
I was recruited. I had two wonderful mentors there. First, Irving Harris, who's been one of the great visionaries, philanthropically, but also in business. And Irving was chairing the board in 1973 when he asked me to join. And then Newt Minow. Of course, Newt had been chairman of the FCC in addition to chairing Channel 11. So I really learned a lot from both of them. And at the time, there was basically the way to think about it is here's content, and here was a very tight filter. Consisted of ABC, CBS, NBC, an independent, and a public. So there were 5 ways to get all of this content out to this enormous audience. And public television, conceived as a non-commercial alternative way of communicating with people. So here was this. But then what happened to the technology? All of a sudden it was no longer this. Now it's this. And there's this whole swath, not only of channels, but as you mentioned, of internet, etc. There are lots of ways to get to increasingly fragmented markets.
Right.
And so I think what public television has been doing and needs to continue to do is to focus in on what is the market where we really are adding value to people's lives. And clearly...
Which are not necessarily addressed by the commercial.
By the commercial, yeah. Exactly. And clearly one aspect of that is children. And the Sesame Seed experience. Channel 11 now is doing a lot of original programming for children. So targeting there. The other, I think, fascinating is older people. We're thinking about that both at the museum and clearly at public television, because here are people who are living longer, with more health, with some disposable income.
But advertisers don't like to focus on them.
You got to be the 18 to 34 or whatever it is that. So I think there's great opportunity for public television at both ends if it invests adequately in 2 things. One is the programming content, and second is the technology to make sure that it's current. At the museum, one of the most dangerous things that we do is overinvest in technology that 2 years later, kids come in and say, oh, golly, that's old stuff. And so I think, the public, and then, of course, Channel 11 also has WFMT, 98.7 on your FM dial for classical music. Now, again, if you go to the spectrum as to how much classical music is actually out there, it's very, very little. Our share here, and we're one of the few remaining classical radio stations, our share here is about 2%. 2.5% if we do well, 1.8%, but it's 2%. But what we're able to do now with the internet is to reach this global audience. And when you hear some of our letters that come in, when the announcers will read them over the air, they're not from Valparaiso, Indiana, but they're from all over the world. And so I think there's a great opportunity for public television and public radio, but also classical music radio. Our family is tied together by public radio. We have kids here, we have in Chicago, we have them in St. Louis.
Your family in particular.
My family,
yeah. Exactly.
And that's the thing that we all have in the course of the day. We know that we have
it's a shared experience.
Listen to National Public Radio.
Well, that's fascinating. I think this is a great way. We just have a few minutes left to end the program. In Time TV, of which Eye on Harvard is one of the shows, is very much dedicated to that concept of individuals of like-minded interests or shared interests can literally globally share those experiences via talk shows like we're doing here. We were taping from Munich with Harvardians. Mm-hmm. You're a distinguished Harvard graduate, although obviously your career goes way beyond that. And so to share that idea, and of course every individual person's experience is important, but I think the message that you're sending out and the Field Museum is sending out is especially important. And hopefully we at In Time TV obviously are privileged to have your perspectives, but hopefully we can help through this program get that message out.
Great.
The evolution is a scientific idea, and not to negate faith, but the suppression of this scientific idea is not going to be valuable for our society in the long run. Do we have a couple minutes left? Anything, actually a minute and a half, anything you wanted to get out to our worldwide audience? We've been seen in 6 continents.
6 continents, great. Well, there's a lot going on. As I mentioned, we're in 94 countries around the world.
But they should all come to Chicago.
Everybody should come to Chicago and see what it is that we're doing. We've got great books that I mentioned, the Neil Shubin's Inner Fish.
Inner Fish, yes.
Princeton University Press published, and we had the opening ceremony for The Birds of Peru. And we've worked in Peru for over 100 years. The wonderful diversity of life in Peru. Now we've got the bird book. of the birds of Peru. We are publishing, and I have the advanced copy of the seashells of the Florida Keys. We're going to do the same things with mushrooms of the Chicago area. So we got a lot of great books coming out in addition to the exhibitions.
Well, life is indeed a beautiful thing, and the diversity, and I think I guess one of the best endorsements, if you will. You mentioned come to the Field Museum. I could say come to the Field Museum. My daughter, however, 12 years old, was absolutely thrilled. I think her endorsement is the one that really rings true.
Absolutely, you bet.
So thank you very much for joining us this hour on Eye on Harvard. Our guest, John McCarter. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Me too.
We'll see you next week.